There we go. Whoa! Come back. Over here. There we go. All right. In this lab that we're going to talk about the endocrine system. This is the first lab of A&P2, exercise 39 in your lab book. And there's a few things to note, and I have models here today to try to represent some of the things that you need to know. So starting at the top, quite literally, we have two very important structures shown on this model of the sagittal head, human head. And that is something you learned in A&P1, the hypothalamus, this region right here, right, that you mark the thalamus by this, right, kind of eye-appearing large circle here in the very middle of the brain. So hypo, beneath, the hypothalamus is right in this region, right? So as we get a little closer here, right in the region here. Okay, we can always mark the hypothalamus because of the optic chiasm and, of course, the infundibulum. And the infundibulum leads to a very important pituitary structure, very important endocrine structure, the pituitary gland, shown here. Very small, looks like a cherry on a stem, often is described that way. Okay, you are learning that the hypothalamus here is really a master controller of the secretions of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is divided into two regions, named appropriately according to their position: the anterior, right in front of the face, nose, anterior pituitary, and the posterior. Now, the anterior pituitary is fairly large in the scheme of the whole pituitary gland, and it is responsible, has a lot of secretory cells, and is responsible for producing 5 different hormones that we're going to talk about with the endocrine system. And all of these are controlled by the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus begins by secreting a substance that we usually call a releasing hormone, or sometimes there's an inhibiting hormone, that then triggers the anterior pituitary, the cells there, to begin making one of those 5 hormone products that we're going to ask you guys to study. Now, the 5: growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone cover the ones that we want to discuss in this class. And we'll want you to know not only that these are made by the anterior pituitary, but we also want you to realize what they target in the body. Now, the posterior pituitary gland is actually basically modified neural cells, and the axons specifically of the neural cells, not the entire neuron even, that come down from the hypothalamus and are found then in the posterior region of the pituitary gland, and they store 2 hormones that we're going to be discussing in class. So these 2 hormones are made by the hypothalamus, but they're released from the posterior pituitary, and that is antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Now, if you look at a slide, oops, got to get this correct because otherwise it will get glare off the screen. All right, we move just a little bit more here. No, we're not quite there. If we look at a slide here, and this is a very light slide of the pituitary gland, all right, we see on this one, and barely can you see it, I agree, this outline of the regions between the posterior, which is far lighter in staining, and the anterior. And there's cracks, of course, because this neural tissue is notoriously difficult to section, so you get splits and fissures in the tissue when it's processed and sectioned. But here, if you look at this, again, under your microscopes, this will be a lot clearer, is a much, much lighter area compared to just here, just on the other side. There's the boundary right there. And this is all anterior pituitary, much darker because there's a lot more secretory cells in here, and therefore with secretory cells there you have the nuclei, which pick up a lot of stain, especially the hematoxylin for the nucleus. In the posterior pituitary, much lighter staining because it's more pieces of cells. So this is the majority of the structure are the axons of the neurons, and so a much lighter staining since there aren't the entire cell, including the nucleus and organelles. And oxytocin and adrenocorticotropic hormone would be stored in these cells here, waiting for the proper target to release. the anterior pituitary, this would be where we would have the growth hormone, the prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone would all be made by these cells and then released under the proper stimuli. Now, the stimuli, again, for the release of these, the hormones from the anterior pituitary, is all the hypothalamus. So all of these hormones have some releasing hormone that the hypothalamus makes and triggers then these cells to produce their hormone and release them. In the posterior pituitary, right, we have the oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and they're actually signaled by another event. The antidiuretic hormone, you're going to find, is stimulated by a change in the amount of fluid in the body, and that's why it's called the antidiuretic. Whereas the oxytocin is specifically most active in labor and during lactation, and this is stimulated by muscle stretching of muscle fibers and cells. So we're going to, in the course of learning about the endocrine system, we really have to pay attention to what it is that causes these hormones to be released. And we also then have to figure out what they then target. Now that's the term we use, where in the body, when they're released, made and released, what do they influence? And so that includes what cells or structures they specifically have an effect on, and what is that effect, right? So as we talk about the anterior pituitary hormones, we see that growth hormone has a significant influence on, right, muscle and bone, because that's how we grow. Our bones get longer, we have more muscle mass, and that's what we consider growth. So growth hormone is so named because that's one of the primary targets of growth hormone, right? Prolactin, in favor of lactant milk, right? So prolactin, a hormone made here by the anterior pituitary, is going to influence the production of milk, breast milk, by the mammillary glands. So the target would be breast tissues, the alveolar glands, and the effect would be production of breast milk. Right? The follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, for this chapter, I want you to consider these two pretty much identically. We'll separate them when we get to chapter 22 and talk about reproduction. But right now, as we get started into our exploration of AMP2 and the systems, we really want to keep them together so that we can keep the information straight. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone made by these cells in the anterior pituitary, they're going to target, in the female, the ovaries, in the male, the testes, and they're going to influence reproductive function, right? And then thyroid stimulating hormone, well, hopefully you've all guessed that thyroid stimulating hormone is going to influence the thyroid gland, which looks like a little bow tie. We have a model here for you to look at here in a second. It sits right about here, and thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates these cells in the thyroid gland to produce their hormones. And then we have the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that is in the name, adrenocortico, so adrenal cortex. Adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys, right, which are right about here, about the 12th thoracic to 3rd lumbar. And those adrenal glands, the outer portion called the cortex, because cortex means bark, they will be, when adrenocorticotropic hormone is made by the anterior pituitary, it will then cause the adrenal cortex to begin secreting its hormones. So very similar to what thyroid stimulating hormone does, right? And so this is important for us to know as we begin. We have to understand this influence, and this is a new exploration for you. We didn't really require much of this in AMP1, so we want to bear that in mind as we go forth.